if I can just pass across for you to do that, please. Thank you.
Right, let's get started.
Good, thank you. So, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this current edition of ScotlandIS Tech Tidbits. My name is David Ferguson. I'm Head of Data at ScotlandIS. We are the trade body for digital tech in Scotland, and we're a cluster management organisation managing the cyber, data and managed service provider clusters. So the ScotlandIS Tech Tidbits programme, what is it? It's an opportunity for us to knowledge share and create discussion opportunities around a variety of relevant tech topics. And it's the format is a short presentation followed by Q&A, and hopefully it stimulates discussion, stimulates an opportunity for individuals to follow up, and hopefully create collaborations on the back of it. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Colin Fraser, Director and Co-founder at iConfidential. So Colin is going to talk to us today about third-party connections. And without further ado, I'd like to pass across to you, Colin. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Hi to everybody else. Thanks very much for joining. The background here is iConfidential has been involved with ScotlandIS for a few years. I was asked to do this because I have had some strong views about supply chain and third party generally. My background, about 20 years in the technology industry, and then asked to take on a CISA role at one of our biggest banks in the UK. I've since then created iConfidential and have spent another number of years acting as interim CISO for 5 other organisations. So in total, 20 years technology plus 15 years leading cyber. And I'm an advisor to many other organisations. The story I'm going to tell you today, I'm going to be assisted by some slides I've put together. Please recognise these are my slides that I've put together rather than the sophisticated a presentation style that you might be used to, and that allows iConfidential, my company, to get off the hook if people don't like what they see. So I'm hoping we're seeing a presentation that's got a picture of the hills. And is it big enough like that, or do I need to go on to display, David?
I think it's big enough like that, yes, assuming that there's no smaller text coming forward on perhaps on any of the additional slides.
Let's put it on display and see if it doesn't seem to like that. There we go.
That's perfect. Yep.
Does that work for you all? Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah.
Okay. So iConfidential is a 15-year-old business. We specialize in risk, cyber risk, but broader risk as well. And one of the themes I'm going to bring out today is something that I have been a great proponent on over the years of management roles that I've had, which is allow people to exploit their experience and empower them to go and make more impact. And I'm going to be asking you to do some of that today. I've just lost my presentation. Sorry about that. I want to take you back 5 years to my black swan story that I was telling people about. And what I was saying in 2020 is here's things that you should be considering might be black swan events by 2025. And as you can see from the headings I've got there, maybe the only one that's not been out in the wild has been the quantum broken crypto, but we are seeing some evidence of that being addressed in labs. And so where I'm going to today is I'm going to try and present you the concept of the infinite network. And I'm going to try and take us out of the world we were in a few years ago of thinking of network connections in a parochial way and as pure technologists. And I'm going to encourage anybody who is remotely in the space of thinking about networks, thinking about cyber, promote yourself to Chief Worry Officer and think about the implications of the infinite network that has now arrived. And what I'm going to be encouraging you to do during the next few minutes is to ask that question, what if? Try and extend your imagination to what the next threat might be. I don't have the answers necessarily in this pitch, but I think I've got enough of a catalyst to get us thinking, and maybe in the Q&A we'll develop my thinking a wee bit further. And then I would say if you're in an organization and you don't become the chief worry officer on this topic, well, who is going to do it? And what confidence do you have that there'll be some follow through? So really the question I'm wondering about is, do all the right people know about how our network has extended over the past few years? Back in 2020, we had a network of whatever size it was. By 2022, it had already expanded, particularly catalyzed by a lot of the stuff we were doing with remote working and adding on services from lots of different places to support us through COVID. And by 2027, we're going to be massively more, and we already are massively more. It's that quantum leap in volume where I think we have to change people's perception in terms of network connections from anything they traditionally viewed. So in a technology shop, we viewed a network connection as something that involved technology that we could connect to and we could protect in traditional ways, whether it be firewalls or IDS, IPS, etc. In the business, the network connection, they tended to think in this third-party space of suppliers and restricted their view to that. And I think we have to change people's perception, our own as technologists and cyber leaders, but also our business colleagues, and start thinking about relationships. So the network that we think about is a network of relationships. And then what can we do as technologists to help our colleagues understand a potential predicament? About 5 years ago, what we're trying to do and starting to do was surface not only who we were directly connected to, and this diagram isn't supposed to represent only technology connections, but this is connections we have maybe to a supply chain and to third parties. But what we're starting to identify is that our connections were connected elsewhere, and there was potentially challenge with that. And I'm going to come back to this diagram later. I think the thing we were doing as technologists was within this environment, we were mapping our technology, trying to identify all our external connections and make sure that we had it protected. Now, that's interesting. I've lost my picture, whatever I've done. Oh, there we go. I've got a transition in it. The reality of our connections is somewhat more significant than that simplistic picture that I presented. I took this picture from a company called Risk Ledger, who started out in the third-party risk analysis space. And this represents what they were finding in terms of the interconnectivity with fourth and fifth parties. And they were starting to map out just how big was your network. Now, as technologists, we might not be overly bothered about this because we're protecting the bits that we are accountable for, that we're connected to. But you can understand, if this represents the modern organization, the ripple effect of something happening with this interconnected world. And as technologists, I think we understand the potential for collateral damage. We understand the concept of flat networks in technical terms, and we have a job to educate the business, I think, in terms of the interconnectivity that they're creating, both technically and in business terms. And I have to say, over the last few months, I've started to change my mind about some of the solutions and the approaches we should take to manage this. I have to say, organizations I dealt with 10 years ago and I had dismissed as fairly inefficient and impractical have upped their game, and I think have now got a role to play in this. We need to get on top of this, because this is the traditional world that I'm showing us here, and actually the problem's much bigger, and I'll go on to show you that later. But in this space, what the business needs to understand is, what is our total inventory of relationships. It's exactly the same as all the other assets as technologists and cyber professionals, where we are looking to apply some sort of risk assessment. Is this an important asset to us? How are we going to protect it? How are we going to control it? Whenever a change comes along, does that change the dimensions, particularly in terms of the inherent risk of how we're using it? And then when we stop using it, we decommission it. And the question I'm posing is, have we got a technology audit trail that can complete the supply chain inventory? And what I mean by that is, we were talking to an organization a few years ago, and they were doing network analysis. And they were coming up with some connections coming into their data center environment they didn't understand. And so they mapped it out. What they could identify technically was, here's a shopping center, and they left it there. I, at that time, was acting in a CISO support role, advising the CISO, and I came along and said, that's not acceptable. You need to promote that information you're fined back into third-party management. Just because you've identified it's a shopping center and you don't need to worry about it because you've got your end of the connection protected, that they can't do damage in traditional terms, have our business really got a grasp on what's hanging on the end of that and what's happening at the end of that? You really have to promote that into your supply chain management system. Now, the figure in green is going to change over the next few charts, because what I'm going to extrapolate from that number 500, I'm going to say, as an organization, you're connected to 500 others. That could be technically hardwired to them, or that's business relationships. What's the next thing that we started to do? Well, we actually started to focus in on some concentration risks. Again, customer of mine was doing third-party analysis, went out and found that the data center that was supporting one of their key suppliers, that was supporting one of their critical services, was inadequate in terms of business continuity. Accidentally, they found that another of their critical services was running into that data center through a different third party. And then they found in the end there was multiple running through a data center. And I think they had 4 or 5 of their critical services dependent on a data center that was not business resilient and would potentially have issues. I think our issue as cyber leaders, technology leaders, is we understand the concept of blast radius. We understand that if an issue happens here, how it can reverberate further. And we have an obligation to help our colleagues understand the sorts of risk that they're needing to manage. The question then goes on. Sorry, I forgot to mention the number. So I've now increased my number where we thought we had 500 relationships. I'm now saying, actually, in some of these things, we've maybe got 200 more that are really important to us that we should be sensitive to. And I'm wondering still, how as a technologist can help my business people to find out who exists where. If we go further now and look at, again, this is a made-up diagram, but if we look at some of the further interconnectivity where we now have fourth parties dependent on the same fifth parties, and they are supporting some of critical services. In the green box, you've got a traditional fourth party that we've identified, but out in the red box, we've got a fifth party that seems to be interconnected to many, many people. So I think it's time to go beyond traditional network mapping, and we as technologists have to help the business understand how they could discover who's out there. Now, I'm not saying our traditional network mapping tools could do that, but by a lot of extrapolation of other logs and activities, we can find a lot out. And that indeed is what Risk Ledger, the company that created the diagram, were starting to do. They were getting sources of data coming in, and they were mapping the data and doing overlays. But at this point, if we start to take out, add in this more complex world, we're now saying the organization that thought they had 500 relationships maybe have as many as 2,000 relationships that are important to them, that they need to have a view on whether risk is being managed. And again, as technologists, we might look at a third party and say, I just want to know that you've got technology controls in there, that you're controlling the access in there. But you can get into some other dimensions. But if you actually extrapolate out what this might look like, you could see by analyzing the orange, green, and reds how you can get to the bigger map just by extrapolation. So now let's add complexity and add the bigger challenge. I've already said we think we're managing 500 things, but we're actually maybe managing 2,000. Let's add SaaS in, and this is where I think we get into a more frightening world. As technologists, we've certain obligations, but we don't have all of them, and particularly when we think of shadow SaaS and whatnot, but some of the numbers are quite frightening. Let's assume you were a 5,000 user organization. Analysis tells us that your Microsoft 365 environment has probably 1,200 plus connected applications to that. Google Workspace, if you're using that, it's actually about 4,000 plus on average that get connected into it. Now let's add all your other big SaaS vendors that you might be using. And then let's look at some of the threats. So 55% of shadow SaaS can access core data in some case core systems. 77% of data, I was talking to a CISO of a secure organization, I would define it 2 weeks ago. He does some analysis done by a third party. 77% of the data that moved into Microsoft 365 was open to all. So you've now got potentially 1,200 plus connected applications able to access 77% of the data within Microsoft 365. It's a new type of threat. More significantly, analysis done by more than one vendor that's looking at this space says 70% of the SaaS to SaaS connections are inactive, i.e. somebody played around with them, but they've left them active. So now we start to ask questions about controls and testing. And we've learned through the very simple world that we grew up in, that if we don't have good control over our critical assets, we're in trouble. There's now lots more that has to be controlled. And okay, network connections is one set of control, but for all the environment that's out there and this massive infinite network, have our colleagues who may have the accountability even realized the position they're in? Have they thought of resilience and business continuity? Have they thought of access control? Because best will in the world, Microsoft and Google aren't going to be responsible for access control. You've got responsibility for that. What about data leakage in this new world? Are the right controls in place? So let's just assume the figures are right on that diagram. Of 10,000 plus that I'm now at connections because we've added SaaS in, what we're saying is maybe 7,000 plus of them are inactive. We've maybe 7,000 plus connections to our data that are inactive. So, what does that mean? If we just extrapolate out from my diagram, say this is actually a representation of our network. In the red, well, actually take the green. What we said was 500 or so of our relationships were under management, and we would criticize ourselves that we're not perfect at it. We've got some weakness and we could improve things. Go back to that basic example of, I did some network mapping and I found a shopping center, but I failed to tell my third-party risk management team about it so they could investigate further what sort of business risk is there. We've also got a SaaS environment that we're using that's non-inactive, but what we do know is that SaaS environment's largely unmanaged. So that's over to the left. And actually now in our infinite network, what we're saying is if the numbers are correct, 70% of the connections to our world and potentially to some of our data is ignored. which I would argue takes us into the territory of negligence. So what? And this is the punchline, I think, for us, which is, I said earlier, we have to use our experience. Our experience might not be directly related to that world we see. We may not have the responsibility for the majority of that world, but what our experience tells us is there's danger, and we understand the danger. We understand the danger of not putting controls on things. We understand the dangers of a flat network and something getting in and contaminating wider. So my encouragement to us as a community is think about how we can help surface the information to identify what that network looks like. And there's lots of tools out there. And again, this is where as technologists, we can help. You know, the days of traditional network mapping, we might have used a skybox or something. There's lots of people out there with solutions that can help that very complex world and that infinite network for us. To the degree that we think we need to manage the risk, let's offer help to our colleagues. So let's use that experience, identify ways that we could maybe bring some tools in that would help them surface the information they need to manage things and get threats under control. And then as professionals, be the watchers. Try and make yourself the eyes and ears of the organization that can spot where there's a weakness coming. Get the information into the area of the organization that can do something with it, and then advise them how to deal with it. There's probably a process there somewhere for handling it. And if there's not, we'll have to create one. But let's help with the discovery, communicate both the information we find and communicate about the risks, and then act as a guide to our colleagues in the organization to help them navigate their way through this world of an infinite network. That was my story, which had no technical tools in it, no widgets and gadgets, I'm afraid, David. But it's a world that I am growing increasingly concerned about, particularly as I talk to my peers around the country and find that they're really struggling. Now, the scale of challenge in a lot of this is maybe just data loss, but it can get into misinformation and disinformation. And if we add the ingredient of AI sitting in our organizations now where it's interpreting data, if we allow false data to come into the organization, just think of the harm when AI starts to pick it up. So AI at the moment, if you switch on the Microsoft tool set, Copilot will access, what did I say, was it 70% or 77% of the data is completely open. It can access all of that and interpret it and send it back. So in the age of misinformation and disinformation, there's a challenge. We know that 77% is not for public consumption. It's not even for consumption in the wider organization. We rushed into Office 365 and to use other tools during COVID even faster than we had done before. We don't have that protected. In fact, there's an argument that much of that data is now redundant and should have gone. So we might not be in the catastrophe world, that world where, you know, it is lights out, where it's maybe our core systems keep running, but a lot of those systems that we're relying on in the SaaS environment are pretty important to the way the business works, and harm can be done in there. So that's the storyline.
Great. That's fantastic. Thank you, Colin. That's really interesting. It's incredible to see the way that network just expands, and how that initial cut and view of it actually peels back to having a completely different background. So yes, a real challenge in there. I've got a couple of questions, please, if I may. So one of the questions that I have is, how can Shadow SaaS access core data?
Well, the core data, so any Shadow SaaS that's connected into our world, if we haven't protected the data, so there's a lot of our core data is cut and pasted by users into their end user environment, and that's a simple way into it. Might not get into a core system that's running on a traditional locked down environment in our data centers or even our outsourced data centers, but there's technical terms, shitloads of data just lying around in the end user environment that could be accessed. I'm not saying but could be accessed because you've got unconstrained access in a lot of these interconnections and no access control in large amounts of it by the primary organization.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And how can technology teams raise awareness of supply chain security among leadership and ensure that it becomes a strategic priority?
I think it's telling stories. It's getting a few stories where technology is the root of a lot of the issues, and it's having the storyline and explain to them what could go wrong and why there's a hierarchy of control that's important on our environments, and we can list out that hierarchy of control. Storytelling, I think, does it more than anything, David. It's also sometimes we have to explain to our bosses. We could be in a technology shop and our bosses don't even realize the sort of danger there is. And so one of the things that I would encourage folks to do is continue to network, continue to listen, gather the stories in, and then try and support our leadership in technology who are talking to the leadership of the business to make sure the right things are on the agenda. And at times, you have to go formal on it. You have to say, I think this is a real risk and I don't see it being managed, and so you put it in writing, and you make sure it's not in an aggressive way, but you just make sure it's in writing and it's formally presented.
Yeah. And what are the best practices for gaining visibility into third-party connections, especially when working with suppliers who might not have the same level of security maturity?
Yeah, and this is where I'm changing my my view, David. I was looking at things through blinkered. I had a blinkered view on things, and I had a view there were certain tool sets that could help do that, where we could ask questions. But about 10 years ago, companies like BitSight and Security Scorecard came on onto the territory. Risk Recon was another. And what they were doing was scanning perimeters of organization. And I dismissed them as sort of fly past, lightweight vulnerability scanners. But actually, they would find weakness. What they have now done, they've started to map out what the interconnectivity is, and there's massive capability where some of these organizations have mapped out 1 million plus organizations. I think the other thing is in that SaaS world, again, there's vendors have come out, and if you don't have one of these vendors, then you should really have one in. They'll scan your environments and tell you all the interconnectivity. They'll tell you all the privileged access that there is. They'll tell you the unmanaged stuff. They'll tell you the data that's available to whom, and then they'll obviously tell you of abnormal behavior that's going on as well. So there's quite a few tool sets available that can help and have, in the last 3 years, have come on immeasurably in capability.
And how do you see from the emerging and advanced technologies, how do you see that challenge around authentication and verification with these connections, so that we don't just have a map that runs rampant, so that we have an understanding of where those critical connections may lie and how we differentiate between those and some of these redundant ones that sit on that network but really aren't fulfilling any purpose?
I think there's a tool set. We've got to go in and clean up, and we've disconnect the inactives. I think we have to have a gateway process for the business using them where the business are adding them in. But as long as we've got a scanner in the environment, we can detect when something else is connected, just like we have with traditional technology change control. When a rogue device connects, we get an alert. When there's another connection, we need an alert that says we've got a new connection here. Where is it coming from? Has it been authorized, etc.? So there's a bit of process work to be done if we don't have it. But I do think we have to get one of these scanning tools in. Some of them, promote, they'll do a free trial. And it's worth getting them in. Do a free trial and just see what your environment's like. And that will justify alone the money to spend on then that tool or another tool that will help you.
Great. Fantastic, really thought-provoking. Thanks, Colin. It's yeah, opens up a whole new raft of work within the organisation, but it highlights obviously that risk and the potential and the importance of understanding what that looks like. Amazingly, we've now come to the end of our time. We've rattled through it, and yeah, I think there's so many more aspects that we could discuss, and hopefully we've raised some thoughts amongst the attendees. Hopefully we can get some collaborative discussion following on from that. But please, it just takes for me to thank you very much, Colin, for taking the time today. That's been really informative, and thank you for that. And also to thank everybody who's attended, and hopefully look forward to seeing you all again on the next ScotlandIS Tech Tidbits. Thanks very much for coming. Thank you. Bye-bye.